A black woman is publicly humiliated at a bustling Atlanta protest, spat on and taunted in front of a shocked crowd. The aggressor, Bradley Simmons, thrives on provocation, relishing the fear and anger he incites. But Karen Mitchell calmly reveals her badge as a federal judge, instantly shifting the balance of power and commanding respect. Just wait to see how this tense confrontation unfolds, and how dignity and justice ultimately prevail in the most inspiring way. It was a sweltering Saturday afternoon in downtown Atlanta. The sun blazed over the city square, reflecting off the glass facades of the surrounding buildings, while the distant hum of traffic mixed with the occasional siren. The square was alive with energy. Hundreds of people had gathered for a protest against racial injustice, waving banners and chanting slogans that demanded equality, fairness, and accountability. There was a palpable sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that the voices of the people could not be ignored, that change had to be seen, heard, and felt. Among the crowd moved Karen Mitchell, a woman in her early 30s who had recently moved from a quiet suburb. Her dark blazer clung lightly to her frame in the heat, and her carefully chosen signs, one reading "Justice for All," another "Equality Can't Wait," were held high with unwavering conviction. Karen's brown eyes scanned the faces around her, taking in the determination and resolve etched into the lines of strangers and friends alike. She had come not merely to observe, but to participate, to make her presence a small but significant stand against the systemic injustices she had witnessed in her own life. Karen felt her pulse quicken as chants echoed louder, filling every corner of the square with rhythmic determination. People raised their fists, voices merged into one unyielding chorus of demand, and for a brief moment it felt as though the collective energy itself could bend the course of the day toward justice. But just as that feeling began to swell, the atmosphere shifted. From across the plaza, a figure emerged, a man who did not share the crowd's purpose. Bradley Simmons was a local provocateur whose name had become notorious online for stirring disputes, for using his words to inflame division rather than dialogue. He was mid-30s, wearing a pale blue shirt and sunglasses, with a smug expression that suggested he anticipated attention and confrontation alike. Karen noticed him immediately, the way he moved with a deliberate swagger, scanning the crowd as if daring someone to respond. And then it happened. Bradley stepped closer to her, deliberately cutting through the protective bubble of voices around her. Karen barely had time to register his presence when he made a sudden, shocking gesture, an act so blatantly disrespectful it froze the moment in stark contrast to the energy surrounding them. He spat toward her direction, a contemptuous motion meant to intimidate and humiliate, and in that instant he unleashed a torrent of slurs. The sound of his voice, sharp and defiant, sliced through the square. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. The surrounding crowd recoiled, eyes widening, mouths opening in silent disbelief. People exchanged incredulous glances, some stepping forward instinctively, others frozen in shock, unable to process the sheer audacity of the act. Karen's body tensed immediately, a rush of heat rising in her chest. The indignity of what had just occurred pierced her, igniting a fury that seemed almost too large for her small frame. Her first reaction was a visceral shock, a sharp burst of disbelief. How could someone carry such brazen disrespect in the middle of a bustling public space? The weight of the injustice, the sheer audacity of Bradley's act pressed down like an invisible force. And then the anger rose. It came in waves, a heat that radiated outward from her core, demanding recognition and demanding response. She could feel it not only in herself, but in the collective energy of the crowd. Murmurs swelled into whispers, whispers into low growls of outrage. People's hands clenched, voices shook, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with indignation. It was as if the act had drawn a line between the ordinary day and a moment that refused to be ignored. Karen's eyes met Bradley's for a fraction of a second, and in that brief exchange an unspoken understanding passed between them. He had sought to provoke fear and shame, and she had absorbed it, raw and undeniable as a spark of righteous anger. In that moment, the protest transformed from a routine gathering into a crucible of confrontation, a test of dignity in the face of blatant disrespect. The injustice was no longer abstract. It was immediate, personal, and impossible to overlook. And from the center of that fiery, stunned crowd, Karen realized something essential. This moment demanded a response. Not reckless retaliation, not a surrender to humiliation, but a statement of strength, of unwavering self-respect. The anger, sharp and undeniable, became the first ember of resolve, the first spark that would light the path forward in a day that promised to test courage and character. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her hand instinctively moving to her cheek, where the unexpected act had landed. The initial shock that had surged through her body ebbed, replaced by a heavier, more insidious sensation, a deep sting that was as much emotional as it was physical. Her skin tingled with discomfort, but her mind was the more affected battlefield. Images flickered unbidden, subtle glances in professional meetings, offhand comments in social settings, whispered assumptions that had questioned her abilities and her worth. Every microaggression, every subtle dismissal she had endured as a black woman in America came rushing back, stacking themselves atop the fresh indignity. The humiliation was a weight pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe, making the square feel suddenly smaller, the crowd more distant, and her own body more fragile. Around her, the sounds of the protest continued, but now they were punctuated by the cruel laughter of Bradley and the small cluster of onlookers who had egged him on. Their voices were sharp, mocking, amplifying the sting of the moment. Karen felt the eyes of some passers-by on her, some curious, some sympathetic, but all distant, incapable of bridging the private ache that radiated through her. For a heartbeat, she questioned herself. Why had this happened? Why here, in a public space filled with allies, with people advocating for justice? The unfairness of it struck her like a cold wind, a reminder that even in moments when she felt surrounded by support, cruelty could find its mark. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her grip on the protest sign she had been holding, the paper bending in her fingers. The physical act of holding it suddenly felt heavy, symbolic of the weight she carried, not only in that moment but every day, carrying the invisible pressures of assumptions, prejudice, and societal expectations. Her breath came in shallow, measured pulls as she attempted to center herself, to reclaim some small piece of control. But the sting lingered, a reminder that even the most careful preparation could not shield her from the world's harshness. And yet, amid the humiliation, a quiet, steady flame began to kindle. It started as a thought at the back of her mind. This does not define me. This moment does not determine my worth. She could feel the beginnings of resilience, small but insistent, like roots pushing through concrete. The anger she had felt moments before had been external, a reaction to injustice witnessed by all. Now the pain was internal, intimate, testing her boundaries and her self-perception. It was sharper, slower, but it also carried within it the possibility of strength, the potential to transform discomfort into determination, humiliation into dignity. Karen closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply, feeling the heat of the sun against her face, the hum of voices surrounding her, the subtle vibrations of a city square that refused to pause. In that pause, she reminded herself that no single act of cruelty, no single person's malice could diminish the years of accomplishment, the integrity, and the quiet courage she had carried through her life. She remembered her mother's voice, steady and unwavering. "Hold your head high, even when the world insists on looking down at you." When she opened her eyes, there was a difference. The tremble in her hands had not vanished entirely, but her stance had shifted. Her shoulders straightened imperceptibly, her gaze sharpened. The sting was still there, a reminder of reality's harshness, but it no longer threatened to consume her. Instead, it became a signal, a marker that would inform her next steps. Karen's resolve, once a small ember buried beneath pain, was now beginning to burn steadily. She understood, even in that moment of vulnerability, that courage was not the absence of fear or humiliation. It was the decision to act in spite of it. Amid the lingering laughter of Bradley and the murmurs of the crowd, Karen took another steady breath. She would not allow this moment to define her. She would not allow cruelty to dictate her sense of self. The sting of pain, raw and immediate, had done its work. It had reminded her of the world's unfairness, but it had also revealed a deeper truth. Her strength was hers alone, unshakable, and ready to respond when the time came. The air around Karen felt heavier as Bradley continued to taunt, his voice sharp and relentless, attempting to prolong the tension he had created. But Karen's heartbeat, which had initially raced with anger and throbbed with pain, began to steady. She could feel the collective energy of the crowd, some tense, some uncertain, mirroring the moment's suspense. It was a charged pause, the kind that felt like a heartbeat stretched to infinity, where every second held the weight of possibility. And in that pause, Karen made a quiet, deliberate choice. She reached into her purse with calm precision, fingers brushing against the smooth metal of something she carried for reasons far removed from confrontation. Slowly, deliberately, she drew out a small, shining badge. Its polished surface caught the sunlight, glinting with unmistakable authority. Karen held it up, letting it rest lightly in her hand, her gaze never leaving Bradley's faltering stance. Then her voice cut through the tension, steady and unwavering. "I am Federal Judge Karen Mitchell." For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. The crowd exhaled collectively, a subtle vibration of realization spreading through the square. The man who had moments before seemed untouchable, bold in his aggression, froze. The swagger drained from his posture, replaced by a sudden, unsteady awareness. He had misjudged not only Karen's vulnerability, but the measure of power she carried, the authority grounded in years of dedication, study, and service to the law. In that instant, the imbalance of fear and dominance shifted. Karen didn't raise her voice further. She didn't react physically. There was no need. The weight of her presence, the quiet certainty of her authority, spoke louder than any word could. Her stance was composed, her expression measured yet commanding. This was not a display of ego or retribution. It was a demonstration of unwavering self-respect and moral authority. Every inch of her demeanor communicated a single truth. She was not intimidated, and she would not allow intimidation to define the moment. The surrounding crowd began to change, imperceptibly at first, then more visibly. Those who had been tense, unsure, began to step closer, subtly forming a circle of support around her. Others, who had been holding back, murmuring quietly, now raised their voices in chants of encouragement, their energy shifting from apprehension to solidarity. It was as if the entire square had recognized the courage embodied in that single calm act, the courage to meet hostility with dignity and to transform fear into empowerment. Nearby, police officers who had been observing from a distance began to move forward, their steps measured but purposeful. They approached not with urgency, but with the quiet authority of enforcement, ready to restore order if necessary. The presence of law and the recognition of Karen's own judicial role created a resonance. Injustice had been challenged, and the balance was beginning to restore itself. Bradley, once the center of provocation, now found himself isolated, his confidence eroding under the weight of awareness and accountability. In that moment, hope blossomed. Not a fragile, fleeting hope, but a firm, rising certainty that courage and authority could prevail, even in the face of blatant disrespect. Karen felt it pulse through her, a warmth that steadied her hands and sharpened her focus. She was no longer the recipient of humiliation. She had become the embodiment of measured power, a reminder to all present that respect is not demanded through aggression. It is commanded through integrity, presence, and self-assurance. As the crowd's energy shifted, the square transformed. What had begun as a scene of tension, anger, and uncertainty was now filled with quiet empowerment. Karen's resolve, once tested by pain and indignity, now radiated outward, touching those around her. The moment of humiliation had given way to a surge of hope and the promise of change, not just in the confrontation, but in the understanding that courage could be wielded with calm authority, had begun to ripple through the gathering. In that charged, radiant moment, Karen stood tall, her badge glinting in the sunlight, a symbol of empowerment and a turning point in a day that had seemed poised to test the limits of human dignity. Bradley Simmons was led away by the police officers, his earlier bravado replaced by a stiff, uncertain posture. The sharpness in his voice had vanished, leaving behind the hollow echo of someone who had miscalculated the consequences of his actions. The crowd, which had been tense and divided just moments before, now released the collective breath it had been holding. Murmurs spread through the square, turning quickly into applause, cheers, and expressions of admiration. People clapped and nodded at one another, as if the shared acknowledgement of justice had created a quiet, unspoken bond among them. The transformation was immediate and profound. The square, once tense and charged with anger, had become a space of recognition, respect, and renewed hope. Karen stood in the center of this shifting energy, calm and composed. She lowered her badge, her hands steady, her posture relaxed, but unmistakably authoritative. Her face bore a soft, assured expression, the kind that conveyed experience, poise, and inner strength. The act that had begun as a moment of shock and humiliation had evolved into a testament to dignity and presence. It was a clear demonstration that courage did not need to be loud or confrontational. It could be quiet, deliberate, and profoundly powerful. Each person watching felt it. The difference between authority grounded in moral integrity and the fleeting, hollow confidence of provocation. People around her began to speak in hushed tones, recounting what had happened, not with judgment alone, but with awe at Karen's composure. Phones were raised to record the moment, not for spectacle, but as proof that civility, respect, and courage could overcome aggression. Social media soon filled with videos and images shared with captions that emphasized empowerment and accountability. Viewers were captivated not by scandal, but by example, the idea that one person standing firm and calm could transform hostility into a lesson in integrity. Stories emerged of others drawing inspiration from Karen's response, recognizing that strength is not always measured in volume or force, but in presence, conviction, and moral courage. Karen began to step forward, moving deliberately through the crowd as officers kept a careful distance to ensure the space remained secure. Faces turned toward her, expressions ranging from admiration to quiet relief, as if her composure had restored a sense of order and safety to the moment. Some approached with words of gratitude, others with small gestures, a nod, a smile, a handshake. Every interaction was subtle but meaningful, a ripple of human connection and acknowledgement that extended beyond the initial confrontation. In the midst of the lingering tension, Karen's quiet confidence had created a new tone, one of hope and reassurance. As she walked away, her shoulders squared and her chin lifted high, Karen felt the weight of the afternoon lift slightly from her. The emotional echo of the event lingered, both in her own mind and in the air of the square, but it was no longer a heavy burden of anger or pain. Instead, it was a resonance of triumph and inspiration. The moment had begun with blatant injustice and culminated in public recognition of dignity, power, and moral authority. It was a living example that even in the face of cruelty, one could respond with integrity, transforming fear, humiliation, and aggression into a lesson that resonated far beyond the immediate scene. By the time Karen reached the edge of the square, the crowd had begun to disperse, but the energy remained. The story would travel, shared through conversations, news outlets, and social media feeds, not as a tale of shame or failure, but as a testament to human resilience. People would remember the calm strength with which she met hostility, the unwavering authority in her voice, the quiet brilliance of her courage. Karen's presence had turned a moment of conflict into a lasting lesson. That justice, integrity, and moral courage were not abstract concepts. They were lived, breathed, and demonstrated in every thoughtful, deliberate act. And as the sunlight shifted over the city, casting long shadows across the square, Karen walked on, a living symbol of empowerment. Her resolve, her dignity, and her example would continue to ripple outward, inspiring anyone who witnessed her courage that day, proving that even in a world where cruelty exists, resilience and principled strength could prevail, and could do so with grace.